The first time it happened, I thought the body had been improperly aspirated and residual gas had shifted the torso. That is the kind of thing you learn in school. Post-mortem gas accumulation can produce movement, sometimes dramatic movement, in bodies that haven't been fully treated. But I had already completed the arterial injection. The drainage had been clean. The solution had distributed perfectly. I knew this because I could see the fluid dye in the superficial vessels at her temples, because the intravascular discoloration had cleared from her hands, because the tissue had that uniform firmness that tells you the formaldehyde has reached everywhere it needs to go. And when I turned around, Ada Purvis, 86 years old, dead for over 30 hours, embalmed from the carotid to the capillaries, was sitting upright on my table with her arms at her sides and her chin slightly raised and her eyes closed, like a woman waiting patiently for someone to finish a task so she could tell them something. She was not alive. I need to be precise about that. There was no mechanism by which she could be alive. What she was sitting up, and the prep room was humming, and the fluorescent light with the dead moth in the diffuser panel was buzzing at its usual frequency, and I was standing at the utility sink holding a bottle of cavity chemical, and I understood that I was either losing my mind or I was seeing something that my training had no language for. I need to go back to the beginning to explain how I got to that table, in that room, at that hour, in a funeral home in rural Tennessee that I should never have taken a job at. I'm recording this on my phone, in my car, in the parking lot of a Waffle House off Route 11 in Hardin County, Tennessee. It is 4:17 in the morning. I quit my job 9 days ago. The official reason on my separation paperwork says voluntary resignation, personal reasons, and that part is technically accurate, but everything else in my personnel file at Llewellyn and Sons Mortuary Services is either wrong, incomplete, or describes events that did not happen the way they happened. I need to say what actually occurred during my 11 weeks on the night shift at that funeral home, because I have looked at every rational explanation, and I have exhausted them, and what I am left with does not fit inside any framework I was trained to use. My name is Marcus Braden. I'm 31. I hold an active embalmer's license in the states of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Before Llewellyn's, I spent 4 years at a high-volume funeral home in the Cincinnati metro, Reinhardt Klein, where we handled between 600 and 700 cases a year. I had embalmed well over 1,000 people. I had worked nights. I had worked alone. I was not a person who spooked easily. I was not a person who spooked at all. I took the position at Llewellyn's because it paid $11,000 more per year than what I was making in Cincinnati, and because my mother had moved back to Western Tennessee after my father died. The job was posted on the NFDA Career Board as a full-time night shift embalmer and preparation specialist. 11-hour shifts, 7 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights on, 3 off. The posting said the home averaged 280 cases per year, which for a 2-station prep room in a rural county seemed high but not unreasonable. They served 3 counties. I interviewed over the phone with a man named Dale Purcell, the general manager. He was polite and specific in the way that good funeral directors tend to be. He asked about my experience with difficult restorations, my comfort level working alone, and whether I had any issue with a cooler that ran a little loud. I said no to all of it. He told me the home had been in the Llewellyn family since 1951, and that the building itself was older than that. A former doctor's residence converted and expanded several times. He said the previous night embalmer had left about 6 weeks earlier, and they'd been contracting the work to a freelance embalmer in Jackson who charged too much and drove too slow. He wanted someone permanent. I accepted. I moved into an apartment in Savannah, Tennessee, 20 minutes from the funeral home, and I started on a Monday in early March. The building sat on a 2-lane road about a mile outside Clifton. White clapboard, black shutters, a columned front porch with 2 rocking chairs that nobody ever sat in. The front half was the public side, reception area, 2 viewing parlors, an arrangement office with dark wood furniture and a box of tissues on every flat surface. The back half was the working side, entered through a heavy fire door at the end of a supply closet hallway. Beyond that door, the prep room, the cooler, a small night shift office, a utility closet, and the loading bay where the removal van backed in. The prep room smelled the way all prep rooms smell. That sharp chemical bite of formaldehyde cut with something faintly sweet from the dye and humectant in the arterial fluid. You stop noticing it after the first week. You carry it home in your clothes and your hair, and you stop noticing that too. 2 stainless steel tables with integrated drainage, a portee-boy Mark IV on a rolling cart, wall-mounted cabinets, an aspirator, and a deep utility sink with a sprayer hose. A sealed concrete floor sloping toward a central drain. Fluorescent tubes behind plastic diffuser panels, one of which had a dead moth trapped inside it that nobody had gotten around to removing. The ventilation system worked, but had a particular sound. A low drone that would cycle up and settle back, like the building clearing its throat. The cooler was through a heavy steel door on the far wall. 6 positions on rolling shelves. Thermostat at 36 degrees. Dale was right. It was loud, that deep industrial hum overlaid with the rattle of fan blades that weren't perfectly balanced. My first 2 weeks were normal. I received bodies from first calls, logged them into the intake book, tagged them, moved them to the cooler, and embalmed whoever was next on the schedule. The intake log was a physical book. A large hardbound ledger, not a computer system. Dale said they'd been meaning to digitize, but the family owners preferred paper. Each entry had a line for the deceased's name, date, and time of receipt, who received them. A chain of custody note and a column at the far right labeled disposition. Under that, you'd write embalmed, direct cremation, transferred, or whatever applied. There was also a column I noticed early on that had no header. It sat between received by and disposition, narrow, just wide enough for a single word or short number. In most entries it was blank. In some, there was a small pencil mark, a check, or a dash. I asked Dale about it during my first week. He glanced at the page, said it was an old inventory thing they didn't use anymore, and changed the subject. The way he said it wasn't evasive exactly. It was more like a door closing, softly but completely. The embalming work itself was standard. Rural cases skew older and heavier than urban ones, and there were more home deaths than I was used to, which sometimes meant bodies that had been undiscovered for a day or 2. That affects tissue condition, vascular access, everything. But nothing was outside my training. I filled out embalming report forms for every case, the standard Dodge chemical form with fields for arteries injected, veins drained, chemicals used, pressure settings, condition of remains. I filed them in a cabinet in the night office. Everything was ordinary. In a funeral home, you always know how many bodies are in the building. You come in, you verify the intake log, you confirm the cooler, you count. If there are 3 names in the log, there should be 3 bodies in the cooler or on the tables, minus any released or transferred. The count should always reconcile with the paperwork. This is not optional. It is the most basic element of chain of custody. You are responsible for knowing, at every moment, how many dead people are in your care and where each one is. During my 3rd week on a Wednesday, I came in at 7 and confirmed the log. 2 bodies received during the day shift. Helen Margrave, 81, natural causes, received at 10:40 a.m. Thomas Kinsey, 67, cardiac arrest, received at 2:15 p.m., both in the cooler for embalming. I verified this by opening the cooler door, feeling that wall of cold, chemical-tinged air push past me and counting. 2 bodies, 2 tags, 2 matching entries. I had one embalming scheduled that evening, Helen Margrave, whose viewing was set for Friday. I brought her out to table 1, prepped the room, mixed my arterial solution, and began the injection. Right carotid, drainage from the jugular. The work proceeded normally for about an hour. At approximately 9:15, I heard the loading bay door open. This was not unusual. First calls come in at all hours, and the day shift removal team sometimes brought bodies in late after long transports. But I hadn't received a dispatch call, and my phone showed no missed notifications from the answering service. I stepped out of the prep room, wiping formaldehyde residue off my gloves with a paper towel. The roll-up door was closed. The interior door to the bay was closed. Deadbolt engaged. Side entrance locked. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to nothing but the cooler's compressor cycling through the wall, and went back to work. I finished embalming Helen Margrave at about 10:30, cleaned her, sutured the incision points, set her features, applied basic cosmetics. Then I washed down the table, ran the aspirator through the drain line, and wheeled her back to the cooler to rest overnight before the cosmetician came in the morning. When I opened the cooler door, there were 3 bodies inside. Thomas Kinsey was on position 2, where I'd left him. Helen Margrave's position, number 4, was empty and waiting, but position 6, the far shelf against the back wall, held a body under a white sheet. There was a toe tag. I walked over and read it. The handwriting was in blue ballpoint ink that had smudged slightly at the first letter, and it said the name, Earl Coates. Below the name was a date of receipt, that day's date. The time was listed as 9:14 p.m. 9:14 was while I was embalming Helen Margrave. I had been in the building alone the entire time. No one had come in. No door had opened. No vehicle had pulled into the loading bay. The removal van was parked in the lot, engine cold. I had the only set of night shift keys. I stood there long enough that the cold started to ache in my fingers. I remember the cooler fan cycling and the white vapor of my breath, and the fluorescent light turning the sheet almost blue. I pulled the sheet back enough to see the face. Older man, late 70s or early 80s, heavy-set, gray stubble, a deep crease between his eyebrows that looked like it had been there for decades. He was cold, full rigor. He had been dead for some time. He wore a hospital gown cut up the back in the way they do when a patient dies in bed and the nursing staff prepares the body for removal. There was a faint smell under the formaldehyde tang of the cooler, not decomposition but something papery and dry, like the inside of an old closet. I covered him. I walked back to the night office. I opened the intake log. There, on the next line after Thomas Kinsey, in handwriting that was not mine, and not Dale's, and not anyone's I recognized, was an entry for Earl Coates. Age 79. Cause of death, respiratory failure. Received 9:14 p.m. The received by column said M. Braden. My name, my shift, a body I had never received, an entry I had never written, and the log was the kind with sewn binding, not loose leaf. You couldn't insert a page. The entry was on the same physical page as the 2 I'd verified at the start of my shift. The ink looked the same age as everything else on the page. I called Dale, nearly 11 at night. He answered on the 4th ring, groggy but not annoyed. I told him there was a body in the cooler that I hadn't received and an entry in the log I hadn't made. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "How many total in the cooler right now?" I said 3. He said, "Check the embalming schedule I left on the clipboard." I went to the clipboard hanging by the prep room door. 3 names, Helen Margrave, Thomas Kinsey, Earl Coates. All 3 printed on Llewellyn letterhead, stapled to a routing sheet initialed by the day shift funeral director. Dale said, "Probably just came in during the overlap and Terry logged it before he left. You might have been in the back and didn't hear the van." I told him there was no overlap. Terry Hobbs, the day shift director, had left at 6:50. I'd arrived at 7. Dale said sometimes the removal guys came in through the side entrance and it was easy to miss. He told me to go ahead and embalm Earl Coates in the morning if I had time, or leave him for the day shift. He said goodnight. I sat in the night office for a long time. The overhead light in there was a single tube that flickered at a slightly different frequency than the prep room lights, and it gave the room a different quality of silence, if that makes sense. I tried to make it make sense, and eventually I did what you do when you work in a profession built on procedure. I accepted the procedural explanation. Someone brought the body in. I missed it. The log was filled out. The paperwork matched. Maybe I'd been running the aspirator and the sound covered the door. Maybe I'd gone to the restroom. It was the kind of thing that could happen, even if it hadn't felt like it had happened. I embalmed Earl Coates that night. Straightforward case. Started at midnight, finished at 1:40. Filled out the report, filed it, went on with my shift. 2 nights later, Friday, I came in to find 2 bodies in the cooler. Raymond Fisk, 73, stroke. Louise Beale, 88, heart failure. Both logged, both tagged. I embalmed Louise Beale first because her viewing was Saturday morning. At 11:20 p.m., while I was suturing her right carotid incision, the cooler compressor cycled in that way it did, a deep thrum through the wall that rattled the instrument tray. When I finished with Louise and opened the cooler to bring out Raymond Fisk, there was a third body on position 6. The tag said June Tolliver, but this time the hospital bracelet on her left wrist caught my attention first. It was from a facility called Ridgeview Convalescent Center in a town I'd never heard of, Maury, Tennessee. I later looked it up. There is no town called Maury in Tennessee. There is a Maury County, but no town by that name. The bracelet had a patient number and a barcode and an admission date from 11 months earlier. It looked completely authentic. It was just from a place that didn't appear to exist. The log, when I turned to it, had a new entry below Raymond Fisk's. June Tolliver, age 82, renal failure, received 11:18 p.m. Received by M. Braden. The handwriting was the same as the Earl Coates entry, not mine. I did not call Dale. Instead, I went through the building room by room. Every door, every window, the loading bay, the side entrance, the front entrance. All locked. The removal van was cold, engine off, parked in the same spot it had been when I arrived. The odometer matched the mileage log I'd started keeping after the Earl Coates incident because I wanted to know if the van was being moved without my knowledge. It hadn't been. I went back to the cooler. June Tolliver was real. She was cold, in rigor, in the hospital gown. An elderly woman with thin white hair and papery skin and the particular hollowed stillness of someone who had been slowly dying for a long time. I stood next to her in the cold and I could hear nothing except the compressor and the fan blades and my own breathing. Then I embalmed her. Her veins were fragile and I had to raise the femoral instead of the carotid. I used low pressure, about 4 pounds per square inch, and a mild solution because her tissues were dehydrated. I filled out the report, filed it. At the end of my shift, I wrote a note for Dale that said, "Third body appeared again during shift. Same pattern. Need to discuss." The note was gone from his desk the next evening. When I asked him about it Monday, he looked at me with a polite, blank expression and said he hadn't seen any note. He pulled June Tolliver's arrangement file and showed it to me, complete. Arrangement contract, casket selection, obituary draft, service schedule. Signed and dated. The family contact was a daughter named Ruth Tolliver, with a phone number and address in Waynesboro. I want to be clear about what was happening and what was not. Bodies were not appearing in an empty building out of nowhere. Bodies were appearing in a building that already contained bodies during my shift, without any evidence of transport, entry, or human involvement. The paperwork was always complete. The families were always real. The arrangement conferences always happened. The viewings proceeded normally. Every case that materialized on Position 6 during my shift was processed through the funeral home's normal pipeline, and no one other than me ever registered anything unusual. It happened again the following Thursday. 2 when I arrived, 3 by midnight. Walter Fain, 84, congestive heart failure. Same handwriting, same attribution to me. I embalmed him before dawn, and the Tuesday after that, and the Thursday after that. Always a third body. Always Position 6. Always elderly. Always natural causes. Always in a hospital gown. Always in rigor. Always cold. Always tagged. Always logged. Always with my name as the one who received them. During my 5th week, I started paying closer attention to the unnamed column. I went through the ledger page by page, years of entries. Most had nothing in that column. Some had a small pencil dash, or a check, or occasionally a single digit. I marked which entries carried those marks and cross-referenced them with dates. It took several nights. What I found was this: the marks appeared in a pattern. Every third intake running continuously through the ledger had a pencil mark. Not every third intake on a given day. Every third intake total, numbered sequentially, going back as far as the book went. I counted forward from a marked entry. Unmarked, unmarked, marked, unmarked, unmarked, marked. This held through hundreds of entries. The most recent marked entry was Earl Coates. 3 entries before him, a mark. 3 before that, a mark. And the bodies that appeared on my shift were all third bodies. They were the entries that the marks corresponded to. But here is the part that changed the nature of the problem. The pencil marks were lighter than the ink of the name entries. They had been placed in the column before the names were written, before the bodies arrived. The ledger had been marked in advance, the way you'd reserve a seat at a table. I was sitting at the night office desk when I put this together, and I remember the overhead tube flickering and the faint taste of burnt coffee from the pot I'd forgotten to turn off 2 hours earlier, and I remember pressing my thumb against the pencil mark next to Earl Coates's name and thinking that whoever or whatever had made this mark had known, before Earl Coates died, or at least before he arrived, that this slot belonged to something. The next week, I bought a small battery-operated trail camera, the kind hunters use, and mounted it inside the cooler, pointing at Position 6. Motion-activated recording. The next time a third body appeared, I pulled the camera immediately. The memory card was blank. Not corrupted, not erased. The camera had recorded nothing because, according to its motion sensor, nothing had moved. The body was simply present in one frame of background and absent in the previous one. But the camera had not detected the change as motion because there was no motion to detect. There was no transition. There was only absence and then presence. I tried continuous video with my phone, propped against the wall with a portable battery bank recording at 1080p. 2-hour window. During that window, a third body appeared. When I reviewed the footage, there was a moment at the 1 hour and 6 minute mark where the time code jumped from 106:14 to 106:14. The same second played twice. In the first instance, Position 6 was empty. In the second instance, there was a shape under a white sheet. No cut, no edit. My phone had recorded a body appearing in the space of a duplicated second. I have that video. I've watched it probably 100 times. I showed it to 2 people. One said it looked like a buffering error. The other said the shape might be a shadow from the door opening. The door does not open in the video. During my 7th week, I found something in a supply closet that shifted my understanding again, though this time the evidence was temperature rather than text. I was looking for extra toe tags on the top shelf, and my hand brushed a cardboard banker's box that had been pushed to the back behind a case of disinfectant. It was taped shut and labeled Archive Personnel in black marker. Inside were employment records going back to the 1970s. Manila folders, one for each employee, with applications, license copies, tax forms, and separation paperwork. I was looking for information about previous night embalmers. What I found was that the position had been filled by 14 different people since 1974. Average tenure, 8 months. Some lasted a year, some lasted 3 months. One lasted 6 weeks. The separation paperwork for almost all of them said the same thing: voluntary resignation, personal reasons. A few said relocation. One said medical leave, did not return. None had been fired. None had been promoted to day shift. I started looking for them. Some names were too common to trace. A few turned up on social media with careers in completely different fields. 2 I found obituaries for. Gary Vaughn, night shift 2003 to 2004, died in 2009 at 42. The obituary said he'd been a funeral professional early in his career but left the industry. Cause of death unlisted. The family requested donations to a mental health nonprofit. Patricia Dewey, night shift 1991 to 1992, died in 2006 at 51. Her obituary mentioned several funeral homes and a long illness. The next day, at shift change, I caught Terry Hobbs in the break room filling his thermos. Terry was the day shift funeral director, early 60s, quiet, the kind of man who communicated primarily through nods. I asked him how long he'd been at Llewellyn's. 22 years, he said. I asked if he remembered any of the night embalmers. He screwed the thermos lid on and looked at the wall above my head. Some, he said. I asked if any of them had mentioned anything unusual about the night shift. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "The good ones don't talk about it. The ones who talk about it aren't here long enough to matter." I asked him what he meant. He picked up his thermos and his keys. "The night position is a specific kind of work," he said. "Some people fit it, some don't. The ones who fit it do good work and keep quiet and eventually leave on their own terms. The ones who don't fit it leave faster." He stopped at the door. "You do good work, Marcus." Then he left. It was the most I'd ever heard Terry say at once. I stood in the break room and looked at the coffee rings on the counter and the motivational calendar someone had pinned to the corkboard, still turned to February, and I thought about how "you do good work" could be a compliment or a warning, and that Terry probably meant it as both. In the 8th week, I opened the old intake ledgers. Not the current one, but an earlier volume I found in the archive closet, dating from 1987 to 1993. I went through it with the same method. Unnamed column, pencil marks, counting. The pattern was identical, every 3rd entry. I found a ledger from 1979 to 1986. Same pattern. A fragment of one from the early 1970s, water-damaged and partially illegible. Where I could read the entries the pattern held. The funeral home had been receiving 3rd bodies for at least 50 years. Every 3rd intake marked in advance. A body that arrived by no observable means. A body that was processed through the funeral home's normal operations and buried or cremated and mourned by real families, with real grief. I want to tell you how this felt because I think the feeling matters more than the mechanism. It was not terror. It was the slow, heavy vertigo of realizing that the ground you've been standing on is not what you thought it was. I had been trained in a system, the chain of custody system, the intake system, the documentation system, and I had trusted it the way you trust the floor of your house. And now the system was doing something I could not explain, and it was doing it perfectly. Every form was filled out. Every family was notified. Every body was real and identifiable and had a cause of death and a medical record and a next of kin. The system was not broken. The system was working. That was the problem. The system was working in a way that included something impossible, and it was working so smoothly that no one but me noticed. Around this same time, I started recognizing something about the embalming work on the third bodies. This is the part I have struggled the most to describe because it involves a physical sensation that I don't have precise language for. When I embalmed the third bodies, the ones that appeared, the work went differently than normal intake cases. Not worse, not harder. The opposite. The arterial injection distributed perfectly. I could see the fluid dye appear in the superficial temporal vessels almost immediately, a faint flush tracking under the skin like a tide coming in. The drainage was clean and complete. The tissue response was ideal, that slight firmness and warmth of color that tells you the formaldehyde has bonded with the protein and everything is being preserved the way it should be. My sutures closed cleanly. The features set with almost no adjustment. The cosmetics took to the skin as if the skin had been waiting for them. Embalming is not easy work. Even routine cases present problems. A vessel is hard to locate by palpation. The drainage is sluggish. One side of the face won't perfuse as well as the other. You use supplemental injections, surface packs, restorative wax. Every body is different. Every case is a problem to solve. The third bodies were not problems to solve, they were already solved. The work felt less like preservation and more like completion, as if the body had been prepared for being prepared, as if it had arrived expecting my hands. I would inject the solution and feel, through the pressure gauge, through the tubing, through the table itself, a kind of acceptance, a readiness. The body wanted to be embalmed. The body had come here to be embalmed by me, specifically, on this shift at this table. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you what I felt through the tools of my trade, through the equipment I use every day. And what I felt was a difference I could not attribute to chemistry or technique or luck. And then, in the 9th week, the bodies started sitting up. I have already described the first time, with Ada Purvis. But I need to tell you about the pattern that followed, because the pattern is what convinced me this was not malfunction or hallucination. It happened with the next third body, Albert Greer, 91, pneumonia. Same thing. I stepped away from the table to rinse an instrument in the sink. Came back. He was sitting up. Arms at sides, back straight, chin slightly raised, eyes closed. Same calm stillness. I guided him down. He stayed down. His viewing Monday was uneventful, and the one after that, and the one after that. Always during embalming. Always when I stepped away from the table. Always after arterial injection but before cavity treatment. As if the window between those two phases was the specific interval. I developed a test. I completed the arterial injection, confirmed distribution by checking the fluid dye in the vessels at the temples and the backs of the hands, and then turned my back deliberately. I counted. At 5 seconds, I turned. The body was still supine. I turned away again. At 6 seconds, I turned. The body was sitting up. I tried it again the next time. Same result. Between 5 seconds and 6, the body changed from horizontal to vertical. But there was no muscular effort, no sound, no vibration through the table, no creak of the stainless steel. Nothing. Between 5 and 6 seconds, the body simply was in a different position. I set up my phone to record one of these events, propped it on a shelf behind the table and recorded myself performing the injection, stepping away, turning my back. After 6 seconds, I turned and the body was sitting up. But the footage showed that same duplicated second phenomenon. The body supine, then the body sitting, and between those two states a timestamp that repeated itself, as if reality had blinked. During this period I was not sleeping well, I want to be honest about that. My appetite was poor. I was drinking more coffee than was probably advisable, and I'd started keeping a bottle of whiskey in my apartment that I worked at after shifts. Not to excess, but more than before. I was functioning, I was doing my job. I was doing it well, in fact, because the embalming work on the third bodies was the best work I had ever done in my career, which was its own kind of disturbing. Families kept telling the day shift staff how wonderful their loved ones looked. Dale pulled me aside once to say I was the best night embalmer they'd had in years. He said it with a kind of relieved gratitude that I now recognize as the relief of a man whose machine was running smoothly again after a 6-week interruption. In the 10th week, I did something I probably should not have done. I found the Llewellyn family's personal number, not the business line. I called it on a Saturday afternoon. A woman answered and identified herself as Nora Llewellyn, the widow of David Llewellyn, who had run the funeral home from 1978 until his death in 2016. She was in her 80s. She was polite. I told her I was the current night embalmer. She said, "Oh." Just, "Oh." And then she was quiet for what felt like a very long time. I could hear a television in the background, something with a laugh track, and then I heard her mute it. I asked about the every third pattern. I didn't use those words. I said I'd noticed something about the intake log, about every third entry, and I was trying to understand the history behind it. She didn't ask me to clarify. She didn't pretend not to understand. David noticed it in 74, she said. His father noticed it before him. They didn't talk about it. Not to each other, not to me, not to anyone. David kept it to himself for almost 20 years before he told me, and he only told me because he was having the dream. I asked what dream. She said, "The night embalmers have the dream eventually. David didn't because he was days, but his father did. It's the prep room, but larger. More tables. And every table has someone sitting up, and they're all waiting, and you understand that you haven't finished, that there's still work to do, that the work doesn't end at the walls of the building." I asked her what the third bodies were, where they came from. "The home provides a service," she said. "It always has. Some of the people it serves arrive by appointment. Some arrive on their own. David's father used to say that the building sits on a seam, not a crack and not a doorway. A seam, where one kind of death meets another kind of death, and the ones who need preparation find their way to the table." I asked her if the bodies were real. She said, "Of course they're real. They're real people who really died. They just don't arrive through the door." I asked about the sitting up. She was quiet again. I could hear her breathing and the muted television and what might have been a clock ticking. Then she said, "David said they were saying thank you." I waited. "His father said they were sitting for their portrait, like the old photographs. You know how people used to sit very still. He said they were presenting themselves, showing you the finished work." I asked what she thought. "I think they're making sure you see them," she said. "Not the body, the person. I think for that one moment, between the injection and the cavity, there's still enough of a person to want to be seen by the person who cared for them. And then they lie back down, and they're just a body again. And the family comes, and the service happens, and it's over. But for that moment, someone saw them." I didn't say anything. She let the silence sit. "Are you doing good work?" she asked. I said I thought so. "Then keep doing it. It's important work. The night person is important. The home chooses who it wants." She paused. "Not the other way around." I asked what happened to the night embalmers who left. She said, "They left. It's a job. You can quit a job." But then her voice changed, got quieter, more careful. "Some of them tried to talk about it afterward. That's the problem, not the work. The work is fine. The work is the best work they'll ever do, and most of them know that, and that's why it's hard to leave. The problem is trying to fit it into language afterward, trying to make someone believe you. That's what hurts people. I asked if the home would let me leave. It's not a prison, son. The door opens both ways. You walk out and you find another job and you live your life. Then she said, the column is already marked for next Tuesday. I asked her what she meant. I mean, there's a pencil mark in the ledger for the intake that will happen next Tuesday on your shift. It was marked before you were hired. They're all marked in advance. David checked once and the marks went about 6 months ahead of the current entries. The home knows its own schedule. I went in on Tuesday. 2 bodies in the cooler. By 11 p.m., 3. Hollis Crane, 93, natural causes. I embalmed him. He sat up. I guided him back down. His skin had the smoothest texture I'd ever felt under cosmetic wax. His family wept at the viewing and held each other in the hallway and told the day shift director that he looked like himself, that he looked at peace. Nobody knew my name. I gave my 2-week notice on Wednesday. Dale accepted it without argument, the same way you'd accept a weather forecast. He said he'd start looking for a replacement. He said it with that practiced, level tone, and I understood that this was a conversation he'd had many times. The hiring ad was probably templated. The NFDA posting was ready. The machine was always prepared to intake the next night embalmer the way it was always prepared to intake the next third body. During my final 2 weeks, the third bodies kept coming. I embalmed every one. They sat up, I guided them down. The work was beautiful. The results were flawless. On the second to last night, I tried something different. A third body had appeared, a woman named Opal Baines, age 90, heart failure. I brought her to the table. I mixed the arterial solution. I set up the machine, and then I stopped. I stood in the prep room with my hands on the edge of the table, and I decided I was not going to embalm her. I wanted to know what would happen if I refused. If the system needed my participation or if it would simply root around me. I sat in the night office. I read an old magazine. I drank coffee. An hour passed. I went back into the prep room. Opal Baines was lying on the table exactly as I'd left her. Nothing had changed. No one had come in. The embalming machine was still set up. The solution was still mixed. She was waiting. And I realized that the word waiting was not a projection. I could feel it in the room, the way you can feel humidity. A quality in the air that was not pressure and not temperature, but something adjacent to both. The room was waiting. The table was waiting. The instruments laid out on the tray were waiting. And Opal Baines, 90 years old, dead of heart failure, delivered to position 6 by no observable mechanism, was waiting for me to do the only thing I knew how to do for her. I embalmed her. The injection was perfect. I turned my back. I counted to 6. When I turned around, she was sitting up, and for the first time I did not immediately guide her down. I stood in front of her and looked at her face. Her features were set. Her eyes were closed. Her skin had that warm, preserved tone. She looked like someone's grandmother on a good day, dressed for church, sitting in the pew with her hands folded. I said, "I see you." I don't know why I said it. It came out the way ma'am had come out the first time, involuntarily, from somewhere below the part of me that makes decisions about what to say. Then I guided her down and finished the work. My last shift was on a Friday. 2 bodies in the cooler. I embalmed the first, a normal intake and nothing unusual. At midnight, the third body appeared. An elderly woman named Pearl Dixon, 89, heart failure. I brought her to the table. I performed the arterial injection. I turned my back. I counted to 6. When I turned around, Pearl Dixon was sitting up. Same posture, arms at sides, back straight, chin raised, eyes closed. But her hands were different. Her right hand was resting on the table surface with the fingers extended, and her left hand was raised slightly off the surface, about 3 inches, as if she were reaching for something, or as if she were waving. I guided her down. Her left hand remained slightly elevated even as I lowered her torso, and I had to gently press it flat. It resisted, just barely, the way a living hand resists when it wants to hold its position. Then it relaxed. I finished the cavity treatment. I dressed her, I moved her to the cooler, I cleaned the prep room, I washed the tables, I organized the chemical cabinet. I filed my last embalming report. I put my keys on the night office desk and walked out through the loading bay door and sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes without starting the engine. When I got home, I opened my personal notebook, the cheap Dollar General spiral bound where I'd been recording my own observations independent of the funeral home's paperwork. The last page I'd written on was 7 pages from the back. I flipped past it and stopped. On the very last page of the notebook, in handwriting that was not mine but that I recognized from the intake log, was a single entry. Braden, Marcus A., age 31, received blank, cause blank, disposition blank. The received by column was blank. The unnamed column had a pencil mark. I drove to the Waffle House. I ordered coffee. I've been sitting in the parking lot since. The notebook is on the passenger seat. I have not opened it again. I am not going to count backward through the ledger entries to find out what number I am. I am not going to determine whether I am a third. I am not going to call Nora Llewellyn. I am not going to call Dale. I am not going to call Terry Hobbs, who told me I do good work and meant it as both a compliment and a warning, and who has been at Llewellyn's for 22 years and has never once worked the night shift. I resigned 9 days ago. My Tennessee embalmer's license is still active. My file at Llewellyn & Sons says voluntary resignation, personal reasons. I have not returned to the building. I have not driven past it. I have applied for a position at a crematory in Knoxville. Because crematories don't have intake logs and they don't have coolers with 6 positions and they don't have an unnamed column that knows what's coming before it comes. Yesterday I received a piece of mail at my apartment. No return address. Postmarked Clifton, Tennessee. Inside was a single sheet of Llewellyn & Sons letterhead. It was an embalming report form, the standard Dodge chemical form, the kind I'd filled out hundreds of times. Every field was blank except 2. In the top right corner, where it says case number, someone had written a number. I checked it against my notebook. It is 3 greater than the last case number I recorded during my employment. The embalmed by field has a line. The line is blank, but next to it, in very light pencil, someone has written my license number. I keep picking up the form and putting it down. I keep running my thumb over the pencil marks the way I ran my thumb over Earl Coates's mark in the ledger 9 weeks ago. The pencil is so light you can barely see it. But it's there. The marks are always there before the names. That's how the system works. The reservation comes first. The person comes after. The Waffle House parking lot is filling up now. The early morning people are coming in, the nurses and the road crews and the people who couldn't sleep. A woman in scrubs just looked at me through the windshield like she thought I was in trouble. I'm not in trouble. I'm sitting in my car at 4 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee and a notebook I can't open and an embalming form I can't throw away. And I'm thinking about something Nora Llewellyn said to me on the phone that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She said the home chooses who it wants. She said it like a comfort. She said it the way someone describes a calling, a vocation, a thing you were meant to do. And the worst part, the part that keeps me in this parking lot with the engine off and the overhead lights buzzing the same frequency as the fluorescent tubes in the prep room, is that she might be right. Because in 11 weeks at Llewellyn & Sons I did the best work of my life. The dead sat up for me. They sat up and they were still, and they were peaceful, and they were beautiful, and every family said so. I was good at it. I was chosen for it. And I cannot tell if I am running from something terrible or from the only thing I was ever supposed to do. The form is on the passenger seat. The license number is mine. The case number is waiting. And I keep thinking about Pearl Dixon's left hand, raised 3 inches off the table, fingers extended, reaching for something or waving goodbye or waving hello. And I keep thinking about how when I pressed it down it resisted, just barely, just enough to let me know that whatever was in that hand was not rigor and was not gravity. It was a hand that wanted to stay raised. It was a hand that was trying to hold on to something, or trying to say something that the mouth, sewn shut and set with a needle injector, could not. The pencil mark is already in the column. It was always in the column. The only question is which number I am. And I am not going to count, and I am not going to count, and I am sitting in this parking lot, and I am not going to count.